My stepfather doubted me, so I took his business and fired him. Here's why. Once mocked by his stepfather as a nameless nobody who would never succeed, 16-year-old Ethan Carter swore to overthrow the empire of the very family that looked down on him. 16 years later, in an unexpected shock, he walked into his stepfather's old office, placed the contract to buy the company on the desk, and declared, "I'm here to clean house." Will Ethan turn enemies into allies and build a new legacy? The drama-filled and unexpected story begins now. Ethan Carter stood silently beneath the glittering chandelier, his eyes scanning the brilliant crystals that filled the luxurious dining room. Each light seemed like a cut into his mind, weighing his heart down even more. This was a dinner Ethan would never forget. At just 16, he had lived in this mansion for nearly 8 years, since his mother, Emily, remarried Victor Sterling. Before that, Ethan's life had been confined to a small, cramped apartment in a poor suburban neighborhood where he could only dream of a better life. But since his mother married Victor, the owner of Sterling Construction, the largest construction company in the area, everything changed. They left the shabby apartment and stepped into a new world, a vast mansion, expensive cars, and luxurious dinners like this one. However, nothing was perfect. Though their material life was now without want, Ethan still felt lonely. It was Victor, the man his mother called husband, who always looked at him like an outsider. From his cold stares to his careless words, Victor never considered him part of the family. Their relationship had always been strained, as though Ethan were never allowed into the Sterling world. Victor didn't hide his contempt for Ethan. He made it clear that Sterling Construction, no matter how successful, had only one heir, Dylan Sterling, his biological son. Every time Ethan asked about opportunities to work at the company, Victor would mock him and say, "Who are you if not for the Sterling name, a nobody?" That evening, as the family gathered around the long dinner table, the chandelier above cast a cold, distant beauty. Victor, sitting at the head of the table, raised his glass of wine and began his usual speech. "Sterling Construction is a Sterling family company. Real blood and flesh," he said, his cold gaze resting on Ethan for a moment, as though Ethan were nothing but a ghost at the party. Ethan felt a jolt in his heart. He hadn't expected those words, but they came as a cruel reminder of his place in the family. Victor didn't hesitate to assert that Ethan was nothing without the wealth and name of the Sterling family. Each of Victor's words felt like a sharp knife, slicing into Ethan's soul. The feeling of being rejected, cast aside, flooded back into Ethan's mind. But he didn't cry. He had learned to control his emotions. His heart boiled with a fire of anger, a fury that was impossible to accept. He glanced over at his mother, who said nothing, her eyes fixed on the table as though nothing had happened. Ethan realized a painful truth. Though his mother loved Victor and had chosen him as her husband, in this game, he would never be part of it. What had happened to his real father? He was gone. And now, Ethan had to face this man, a man who saw him as a child with no rights, no place in his world. Victor's cold eyes made Ethan feel like a shadow, not allowed to stand in the light. That night, in his cold room, Ethan sat facing the mirror, trying to see himself again. He had lived too long under the shadow of Victor and Dylan, but now, as Victor's words cut deep into his heart, he could bear it no longer. Ethan silently promised himself that he would prove Victor wrong. He wouldn't stay the abandoned shadow anymore. The feeling of helplessness gradually turned into determination. He was no longer the weak child, no longer the 8-year-old boy who cried in the dark. Now, 16-year-old Ethan Carter was determined to rise and prove his worth, no matter what. The chandelier's light still illuminated the room, but in Ethan's mind, the fire had been lit, a fire strong enough to never be extinguished. The biting cold wind hit Ethan's face as he stepped out of the delivery truck, ready for a hard day of work. It was 5 a.m., and the chill at the Sterling Construction warehouse seemed like it would never subside. He pulled his thick jacket tightly around him, gripping the bags of cement as he pushed them into the warehouse, tiredly. Every step felt like a challenge, but he was used to it by now. Since graduating high school with a 4.2 GPA, an impressive achievement any student would dream of, Ethan had hoped that finally, he would be recognized and given a chance. But no, since entering Victor's company, he had not been given the same privileges as Dylan, his half-brother, who, despite having poor grades, was always given a comfortable vice president's office chair. Dylan, with his lazy and irresponsible personality, could sit and play video games all day without worrying about any work, while Ethan struggled with heavy bags of cement. "Do you want to try a day working in the office?" one of the employees asked when he saw Ethan hauling goods back and forth. "No, I don't think I'll get that chance," Ethan replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm but also sadness. Though he didn't say it aloud, the contempt Victor showed him was always clear. One day, when Ethan tried to ask about promotion opportunities, Victor just laughed mockingly, without the Sterling name. "You're a nobody. These words once again cut into his heart like sharp knives that would never heal. From the corner of the room, Dylan looked over, mocking. "Don't expect anything more than this warehouse. Ethan, you're not a Sterling. You're nothing." He sneered and laughed as if everything was just a joke. Ethan lowered his head, trying to contain the rising anger, but those words felt like a slap in the face, making him feel like a failure. After a long day of hard work, Ethan returned to his room, his legs aching and exhausted. The anger flared up, but it was that very anger that taught him a valuable lesson. No one would save him. No one but himself could change his life. The feeling of helplessness slowly turned into an unshakable resolve. The next day, Ethan decided to leave that unfair job and follow a different path. He joined the Army Corps of Engineers, a decision he knew would completely change his life. The months in Iraq weren't easy, but they were when Ethan found strength within himself. Under the harshness of war, he learned how to endure and developed leadership skills. Every construction project he participated in was a major challenge, but those challenges caused him to mature quickly. He learned how to work under pressure, how to keep a clear mind in dangerous situations, and most importantly, he learned how to become a true leader. After completing his mission in Iraq, Ethan used his GI Bill scholarship to study civil engineering at Ohio University. Despite being in school, he worked the night shift at Baxter & Sons, a major competitor of Sterling Construction, every night, amidst the rumbling machines and the thick dust of cement. Ethan couldn't stop imagining a day when he would surpass Victor, who had always treated him badly. He would not only prove his worth, but also reclaim what had been taken from him. As time passed, Ethan matured. He was no longer the wounded, helpless teenager he once was. He had become a resilient man, with strong ambition and solid skills. The perseverance, determination, and mental strength he forged during these challenging years helped him rise above and overcome all obstacles. He no longer dwelled on the cruel words of Victor or Dylan. Those challenges had become the fuel that kept him moving forward, so that one day he would stand at the peak of glory he truly deserved. With the solid foundation of his studies and work experience, Ethan felt ready to face any challenges ahead. He knew the day when he could change his destiny and conquer Sterling Construction was not far off. Ethan stood in the vast lobby of the Baxter & Sons building, holding a cup of black coffee. But his mind was elsewhere. Everything had changed since he left Sterling Construction. The years of hard work at the rival company had given him deep insight into the construction industry and the mistakes Sterling had made. He had left an empire on the rise to seek new opportunities, but a part of him still longed to return and overthrow everything Victor and Dylan had built. At the age of 30, Victor suddenly fell ill during a board meeting. The stroke left him unable to continue leading Sterling Construction, and not long after, Dylan, his weak and arrogant biological son, inherited the power. But this shift in leadership only brought disastrous failures for the company. Dylan, with no real experience, failed to fully understand the scale and complexity of the company he had inherited. This ignorance led the company into crisis. 3 major lawsuits from clients, 2 serious safety violations resulting in worker injuries, and especially a sexual harassment accusation from one of Dylan's assistants caused Sterling Construction's reputation to plummet. The news flooded local newspapers, turning the company into a laughingstock of the entire construction industry. The company's largest investor, Grayson Partners, immediately withdrew their funds, pushing Sterling to the brink of bankruptcy. The entire financial system of the company seemed to collapse overnight. Ethan stood on the sidelines, but he couldn't help feeling a quiet satisfaction. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for all these years. While he hadn't directly caused this disaster, every failure of Dylan and Victor was now a chance for Ethan to prove that he was the one who could bring Sterling back to the top. At Baxter & Sons, where he had built relationships with some of Sterling's former clients, Ethan worked tirelessly to prove his capabilities. He skillfully presented optimal solutions for projects, helping this rival company secure major contracts and gain trust from clients. Every move Ethan made was carefully calculated, but he never stopped dreaming of the day he would return and overthrow Victor and Dylan. As Sterling's situation worsened, and the company faced the risk of bankruptcy, Ethan realized that now was the time to act. He had saved a considerable amount of money from his work at Baxter & Sons and private projects, along with the relationships he had built over the years. Ethan began to develop a detailed plan to buy Sterling Construction. He used all of his savings and reached out to investors, convincing them of a bright future for the company if he was at the helm. The difficult and tense negotiations began. Finally, Ethan received an unexpected opportunity. When Sterling completely collapsed, he used all the relationships he had worked so hard to build and acquired the company for 60 cents on the dollar, a bargain compared to its true value. A surprising move, and Ethan's calmness forced Sterling's board, who were in a state of despair, to agree. Ethan stood in the conference room of Sterling Construction, looking around at the company's former employees. The feeling of victory washed over him, but there was also a sense of unease. He knew this was just the beginning. What he had achieved was not the end. He had to prove that he deserved the role of leading this company. But now, facing his greatest challenge in Victor and Dylan, the ones who had driven him away so long ago, he felt ready. While Dylan was still immersed in his mistakes, Victor was now just a shadow of the past, and Ethan, with all his patience, intelligence, and strategy, was fully prepared to confront them. Not just for revenge, but to prove that he was the one who could elevate Sterling Construction to new heights. He was ready to do whatever it took to show that success did not come from family power or reputation, but from persistence, ambition, and talent. Ethan Carter, once a neglected child, now stood firm on his own 2 feet. He would not let anyone, not even Victor or Dylan, destroy what he had built. He knew that the empire he was about to create would be stronger, fairer, and more sustainable than anything the Sterling family had ever built. On Ethan Carter's first day as CEO of Sterling Construction, he didn't feel any joy or satisfaction. Although he had imagined this moment for years, working late nights, dreaming of the time he would take this position, the reality was nothing like what he had envisioned. This room, Victor Sterling's office, his former stepfather who had spent his life building this empire, was now the place where Ethan would have to lead, run the company, and leave no trace of the past. He walked into the room without hesitation, not once looking back. Everything was different from the days when he was just a neglected child. The marble walls, the long oak desk, the black leather swivel chair, everything evoked a sense of power that Victor had created. But now, it was no longer his. Ethan looked around the room, feeling that this was the moment to start a new chapter. Ethan placed the acquisition contract on the desk where Victor had always sat, directing and commanding everything. The sense of power in his hands felt different now. He didn't view these things as symbols of prosperity or an empire, but as a legacy that had grown old, a legacy that would be replaced by his own persistence and vision. Just then, the door opened, and Victor walked in. He was still frail, stumbling after his stroke, but his eyes were still full of rage. "What are you doing here?" Victor growled, his voice filled with hatred. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He had been waiting for this moment for years. All the patience, all the long nights he spent fighting in silence, could now erupt in this one moment. He smirked, placed his hand on the contract, and coldly replied, "Cleaning house." Ethan's words were like a slap in Victor's face. He stood frozen, unable to believe that a foster child like Ethan could confront him like that. Victor's fury could no longer be hidden, but Ethan didn't flinch. He was too familiar with Victor's contempt. And now, he was no longer the boy he used to be. At that moment, Dylan, looking disheveled, entered the room. The stench of alcohol hit the air before he spoke. "What's this? This acquisition is illegal." Dylan stormed in like a wild animal, adding fuel to the fire. He stood there, criticizing, shouting, but Ethan simply looked at him calmly, unfazed. Ethan gently set his coffee cup down, walked over, and said, "Let me list a few issues you can't avoid." Dylan. He stared directly into Dylan's eyes, making him fall silent, as if he couldn't face the certainty in Ethan's gaze. 3 major lawsuits from clients, 2 safety violations that injured workers, and a sexual harassment case from your assistant. I don't need to say more about how this company ended up in this state. Ethan didn't avoid Dylan's gaze, speaking coldly. Both Victor and Dylan fell silent, unable to respond. Ethan continued, his voice even but firm. "For all your mistakes, I've decided to fire both of you. Victor, Dylan, you no longer have a place in this company." These words struck like lightning in the air. There was no sound, only a suffocating silence that filled the room. Ethan raised his hand and presented a 2-week severance package to each of them, then sternly added, "You'll need to return the company's property." The next scene was unforgettable. Victor, once the king of this empire, was escorted out by security, amidst the stunned looks of all the employees. His flushed face, his eyes full of fury as he was led out of the room, remained deeply etched in Ethan's mind. A part of him felt a sense of victory. But soon after, he realized that this was the result of a long battle. Just as Victor and Dylan were escorted away, Ethan's phone rang. It was his mother, Emily. She called with a trembling voice. "Ethan, you can't do this. Victor feels humiliated." Her voice choked with pain, a knife twisting in Ethan's heart. Ethan didn't know how to respond. His mother, though loving Victor, had words that tore at his heart. "Mom, I just want to succeed. I can't live under their shadow forever." He struggled to keep his emotions in check, but his mother's voice still echoed weakly. "You can't do this to your family." Ethan. This was the moment Ethan faced his greatest internal conflict. He had fought his whole life to prove his worth, but this victory also meant the fracture of his family. He couldn't help but feel torn, even though he knew this decision was necessary. Still, Ethan held firm in his resolve. He couldn't go back. With a renewed determination, Ethan continued his journey of rebuilding Sterling Construction, not just for the company, but for himself. He would not let anyone, not even family, stop him from achieving his goals. Ethan walked into the conference room, a place that had once been where low-ranking employees had to gather and listen to orders from Victor and Dylan without daring to speak out. Today, this space would be a place of change, where employees would no longer be looked down upon. He stood before a group of employees, some with surprised faces, some with skeptical eyes, but most filled with expectation. The room was silent, waiting. Sterling will be a place where talent is recognized, Ethan declared, his gaze strong and decisive. His words made the atmosphere in the room tense, but also full of excitement. The entire company had been dragged down by Victor and Dylan's unfairness and negativity, but now, everything would be different. Ethan stood there, head held high, looking into the eyes of each employee. He continued, "I want you to know that at Sterling, there is no room for discrimination. We will share profits fairly, reward safety for those who work hard, and promote based on ability, not family connections or reputation. Each one of you deserves the opportunity to grow." The room erupted in applause. The encouragement from the workers who had been overlooked made Ethan feel like one of them. This feeling, this change, was something he had longed for during all those years of being sidelined. Next, Ethan made important decisions. He appointed Claire, Victor's former assistant, as executive assistant to the CEO. Although many in the company were skeptical of Claire's past, Ethan saw in her dedication and excellent work ethic. Moreover, she was one of the few in the company who could help him effectively restructure Sterling. Alongside her, Ethan hired Rachel Nguyen, a talented and passionate woman, as the head of human resources. Rachel was tasked with creating training programs for safety, gender equality, and helping the company rebuild a strong human resources foundation. Everyone in the company was impressed by Rachel's decisiveness and vision, and her becoming a symbol of young talent in the company was undeniable. After 6 months, Sterling Construction had undergone a noticeable transformation. The company not only completed the Grayson project ahead of schedule, but also under budget, something that had never happened under Victor's leadership. This success not only helped the company regain client trust, but also secured a $3 million shopping center contract. Sterling Construction began receiving awards for workplace safety, and above all, the company became a symbol of integrity, completely different from what Victor had left behind. Ethan looked at the company's performance board, feeling pride swelling in his chest. This was the result of relentless effort, the culmination of restoring the values that Victor and Dylan had neglected. Everything was now on the right track, and Ethan knew he had succeeded. But on this journey, there was one person Ethan didn't expect to return: Dylan. 2 years after being fired, Dylan came back, but not as the arrogant man he once was. He was thin, gaunt, and his eyes were full of haunting reflection, as though life had taught him a hard lesson. Dylan had quit drinking, gone through therapy, and decided to apply for a job at Sterling Construction. He wanted to work in the warehouse, a position with little responsibility but an opportunity to start fresh. Ethan looked at Dylan as he entered the room, his eyes still filled with doubt. He couldn't easily forget what Dylan had done, but at the same time, Ethan knew that people could change, and if Dylan truly wanted to rebuild his life, he wasn't going to stop him. Ethan decided to give Dylan a chance. He asked Dylan to report directly to Rachel, who would supervise his work. Dylan could work, but he would have to follow the company's strict rules and not make any mistakes. Dylan worked harder than ever. He arrived early, stayed late, and constantly sought to learn. Gradually, the other workers began to see Dylan in a different light, no longer as the arrogant, selfish man, but as someone who had acknowledged his mistakes and was determined to start anew. At a Christmas party, Dylan surprised everyone when he patiently explained the excavator to Rachel's son, something he had never done before. This small but meaningful act made the entire company view Dylan differently. He was no longer a man of mistakes, but someone trying to atone for his past. Ethan watched Dylan from afar, feeling a sense of pride. He knew that change didn't happen overnight, but Dylan was on the path to finding himself. This was not only a test for Dylan, but also a valuable lesson for Ethan about tolerance and forgiveness. As for Rachel, with her effort and talent, she proved that nothing is impossible with determination and belief in oneself. She not only changed the way the company worked, but also became a symbol of a new generation, young people full of potential, ready to overcome any challenges. Sterling Construction had now become a truly fair and transparent company, and Ethan, as the leader, had not only rebuilt the company, but also created a new culture where effort and talent were always recognized. Ethan walked into the cold hospital room, where Victor, the man who had once been his stepfather, the man he had hated for so many years, was lying in bed. The light from the hospital lamps illuminated Victor's aging face, making him look weak and fragile. Ethan's heart tightened as he saw this image, but he couldn't deny that the compassion inside him was slowly replacing the resentment. Victor was no longer the towering, powerful figure he had once despised. Now, he was just a man facing death. Victor looked up when he heard the footsteps, his aged eyes locking onto Ethan's. These words had likely been prepared for a long time, but the truth was, they came too late. "I was afraid you would surpass Dylan," Victor sighed, his voice weak but sincere. I tried to keep you down because I didn't want to lose the only son who could carry on the family. I was wrong. Ethan, this apology, though late, carried immense weight for Ethan. He looked into Victor's eyes, sensing the sincerity there, but also the pain. The resentment in his heart gradually faded, replaced by a sense of liberation. For so long, Ethan had lived with suppressed emotions, but now, standing before this apology, he knew it was time to let go. He couldn't change the past, but at least he could change his future. Ethan sat down beside the bed, placing his hand on Victor's. "I forgive you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "For your remorse, I will no longer carry any resentment." Victor gave a weak smile, as if the relief had finally come to him with those words. "Thank you," he said, his eyes gleaming with a hint of light before closing again. 2 weeks later, Victor passed away in the quiet of the hospital room, leaving Ethan with mixed emotions. He didn't feel joy, but there was no longer any bitterness. Everything was now over, and Ethan could continue his journey without the weight on his heart. At the same time, Ethan's career at Sterling Construction was at its peak. After the company secured an exclusive $60 million contract with Grayson Partners and other developers, Sterling's name not only soared but was firmly established. Ethan expanded the company, increasing the staff to 350, and one of the most important decisions was appointing Rachel as vice president at the age of 29, marking a key turning point in the company's development and in building a promising leadership team of young talent. When an unexpected accident occurred on site, Ethan didn't hesitate. He immediately halted the project and decided to spend $100,000 on retraining the staff on workplace safety, a strong move to reinforce the company's reputation. This not only helped protect the workers, but also enhanced Sterling's standing in the industry. Once again, Ethan proved that he always prioritized safety and ethics. Even though the company had already achieved exceptional success, the company was not only successful financially, but also built a healthy and responsible work culture. The values that Ethan had instilled, from transparency to fairness, were widely recognized. Sterling Construction was no longer Victor's empire, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where every employee could find opportunities for growth and contribution. As Ethan stood in his office, looking out at the construction site where he had worked 16 years ago, a sense of peace washed over him. The company photos, the certificates, and especially the group photo of the employees at the safety award ceremony now replaced Victor's portrait on the wall. This was not just a change in the company, but a change in his soul. The business card with the name Ethan Carter, CEO, was now a symbol of the legacy he had built with his own hands, a legacy of integrity, perseverance, and the ambition to overcome adversity. One day, Emily visited Ethan in his office. She looked around, her eyes full of pride. "You've done what I never dared to dream," she said, her voice choked but radiant with happiness. Ethan looked at his mother, a faint smile spreading across his face. "Mom, family is really about sharing values, not blood," he replied, feeling the love and bond between them like a warm embrace, covering the distance that had existed between them for so long. In the final scene, Ethan walked out of the office under the sunset, not with the feeling of a winner, but with that of someone who had completed a long and challenging journey. A young worker saw him and looked up with admiration, reflecting the journey from sorrow to glory that Ethan had gone through. He had gone from a wounded boy with no place to stand, to a righteous leader who had rebuilt a strong company and become a role model for those on their own journey to find their self-worth. Ethan's message was clear. True success comes from perseverance, integrity, and the ability to overcome all adversity to define one's own value.